So I'm delighted to be here with Allan Morelock, dear friend and colleague who has been inspired to offer a presentation on what he calls deathing, about the death process and how this relates to us as practitioners of Trillium Awakening and even more broadly. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Allan, and welcome you to guide us through.
Yeah, thank you, Deborah. And I feel very privileged and honored to be making a presentation that hopefully will be of some at least interest, if not benefit, but we hope an optimal benefit. Whoever is drawn to and chooses to view this and listen in. The subject of what I think of more as the conscious transition, or the transition in and out of the human domain, has been a long-term passion of mine. Let me kind of prelude this by saying I don't have any absolute truths here. It's more, to me, it's more of a matter of what's the highest discernment I can derive from my experience and understanding at this moment, and being completely, as well as I can, able and willing to move to the next highest level when greater consciousness and material presents itself. And so for me, it's a matter of what's the highest thought we can grasp, because I think that effort to grasp more subtle and what I'm calling higher thought is part of how consciousness clarifies itself, which is the great undertaking I think that we all have in common. How can the self be more revealed and clarified to itself in the form of our particular viewpoint, our particular vehicle? So hopefully I'm going to say some things that will challenge people and generate not necessarily backwash, although that's certainly possible. I want to say that as a teacher, I'm almost using that term reluctantly, but don't have a better word for it right now. I'm far more interested in exciting a question in people. I want to see how these big questions, these important questions, at least as I see them, how much can we excite that question in people? Because I think the questioning is far more useful to us than answers. Answers can be helpful to break up old constrictions based on the previous paradigm that we lived under. So we want to start with a section on giving a definition to what we mean by the human/earth. So the way I define what does it mean to be human, what does it mean to be in the earth in terms of this discussion, I call it a frequency bandwidth. So there's a high range and a low range. And just as every organ in the body has a container for the organ, what do they call those containers around the organ? The
sac, or?
It's a sac-like tissue that isolates and gives a border to the heart, the lungs, the brain, all the different organs. They have this container. And then for the body overall, there's a container we call the skin. So this frequency bandwidth has a skin. And within that skin, we have this miraculous occurrence that we call the human/earth. So that skin or membrane, there's two components just like on the skin. It keeps inside what belongs inside, and it keeps outside what's not, which shouldn't be inside. And within the parameters of that skin occur what we sometimes call the laws of nature. these laws, in my opinion and understanding, apply to everything that's in the frequency, the human/earth frequency bandwidth. What's within that is operating according to certain laws or conditions. And so that's, an example of that would be some people see angels. Most of us don't see angels. Now, I presume that some people who see them, there must be angels. Because enough people say they see them and there's enough history of angels. I don't know. I'm not here to define what they are. It's not the job. But the point is, they're not within the frequency bandwidth. So they don't necessarily behave according to those laws. And part of that, the next part of that I want to talk about is what I call brain consciousness. To me, and I think probably everyone listening to this or watching this, we have an agreement or an agreed upon understanding, hopefully based on experience, that consciousness itself is infinite. It has no boundaries, it has no limits. It has no, in its deepest sense, it has no definition or structure within its purest state. And brain consciousness then means a very small sliver of that greater consciousness that is made available or isolated by the functioning of the brain. And when I say the brain, I include a lot. I'm including a lot more than that. Of course, the whole nervous system and who knows what else is going on that enables this consciousness to be available. So when, for example, many scientists today argue, and they're still searching for where consciousness gets generated in the brain. And I think it's interesting that they've done this research now for about 40 years and have made no progress with it. Yet they insist on believing that consciousness is generated by the brain. What I'm saying is I don't think consciousness is generated by the brain, but the brain is highly important to isolate or locate a certain small sliver of the great bandwidth of consciousness. I heard one scientist, I don't remember who it was, who said that of all possible experience that's here for us, potentially in consciousness, if you put that on a linear scale, which you can't do, but if you could, on a 100-mile scale, we're experiencing 6 inches out of 100 miles. That's how little of the great consciousness is made available by brain consciousness. And the way that brain consciousness works, to help understand the structure that I'm talking about, the information, a certain amount of information or stimuli comes in through the senses. And then that data or information that's coming in through the senses stimulates a very complex, very high-speed algorithm within the brain, and the brain generates what we call an experience. Now, the neuroscience that I've studied, which is very little, but I love the guy Bo Lotto, and I read his book and underlined a lot of stuff in his book because I was so fascinated by his work, because it coincided so much with my understanding of consciousness in the Vedic teachings. So according to Bo Lotto and the neuroscience, the work that he's done, the information coming through the eyes then generates this experience in the brain. But what we think we're perceiving through the eyes, 90% is generated by the brain. 90%, only 10% of the actual information is coming through the eyes. Actually, I think it's more than 90%, but I'm happy to go with the 90%. And the brain has certain biases. If you want to study brain bias, there's tons of information, videos on YouTube and research on brain biases. And from my understanding of Bo Lotto's work, the great bias of the brain is to avoid uncertainty. The brain has evolved with this primary objective to avoid uncertainty. Because go back a couple hundred years ago, 300, 400, 500 years ago, if an individual person stopped to observe, let's say a tiger, out of curiosity, he didn't go into the DNA pool, he went into the food chain. He had to react faster than he could think. So that reaction is what what sort of generated part of the survival of the species. So there's a very, very important bias of avoiding uncertainty. The second bias that I may want to talk about is confirmation bias. Let me just say a little bit about my understanding of confirmation bias. Confirmation bias says that once we generate a kind of systemic paradigm of what we think of as reality, and we're driven to do so in order to be safe. So the brain bias is to be safe, to avoid uncertainty. And then we generate some understanding of the world and life, of how to function, how to understand, and how to relate. Whereas we're driven primarily to be safe. And then secondarily, we have this confirmation bias. Confirmation bias works like this. We're constantly searching for what agrees with our paradigm. Now, here's the interesting part of another researcher, and I wish I knew who it was, who studied this and found this. I haven't been able to find. I heard her talking about it. I haven't been able to recall who it was. But it's a fascinating study. They found that when a person is presented with something that doesn't agree with their current paradigm, it causes disturbance in their system. And at some point, the brain basically generates a lie. The brain fabricates a version of that event which agrees with their confirmation bias. Now, when the brain generates that lie or discovers a lie, the brain generates a chemical that's equal in addictive power to cocaine. So this confirmation bias is very, very powerful. And if you follow anything about politics, which I don't recommend you even do, you can see how this is kind of running people's lives. The other thing I want to mention briefly, I mean, we could go on and on about this, but I want to mention briefly polarization. So I see polarization as a fundamental, kind of a fundamental signature of what it is to be in the earth frequencies, what it is to be in the human body. Black and white, up and down, good and bad, right and left. Polarization, and I actually prefer the term polarization to the term duality. Duality has picked up a lot of baggage, I guess I would say. But understanding polarization, that is fundamental to living in the earth. But I said living in the earth. We don't live on the earth, we live in the earth. This is another thing. See, we've kind of been trained to think we live on the earth, but if you think about it, the earth itself contains earth, water, fire, light, and space. So the air around us contains those same elements. Earth is more concentrated below our feet, but if we're on the earth, it would mean we're at the edge of the stratosphere or something. So we're actually in the earth, just as pieces of our body are inside our body. It's a minor point, but worth mentioning, I think. So now understanding this survival mechanism that sets in, I think is really important. And the whole polarity thing. Let's see, I think we'll come back to some of that later. It'll fit in better later. But we do want to say something here that one of the powers that we have, and this is a little bit out of context in terms of the flow, but I want to mention it now. One of the powers that the human has in terms of how to relate into the world is the power of questioning. I mentioned before that I'd like to stimulate questions more than to give answers. So questioning, and I had a teacher once who drew the human head and pointed out that if you look at the head from the side, it's like a big question mark. So I'm convinced that the life around us that we call the universe or the world responds to our questions and doesn't give us the answer, but gives us experience from which we can derive answers according to our level of consciousness or development. And I'll just give a quick example of that, and we'll probably come back to this later. How many times have you said to yourself or had one of your students or friends say, "What is wrong with me?" And almost everybody you work with or meet, if you really get inside their psyche, they have this thing, something's wrong with me. Either something's wrong with me or something's wrong with the world. So every time we ask that question, what's wrong with me? Life sort of says, oh, he wants to know what's wrong with him. Okay, so we'll give him experience of something wrong with him so he can explore that. Life is here for us to explore. That's one way to look at it. So every time we ask, why am I so broke? What's wrong with my health? What's blah, blah, what's wrong? Life just keeps giving us that experience so we can explore what that's all about. One way, again, this is a little bit out of context, but I'll mention it briefly because I don't know if we'll have time to come back to it. One way you can actually use this questioning power is to start asking questions like, why am I always so happy? Why is my life so easy? Why do I have so many friends? Why am I so healthy? Why does money come to me so easily? Just try this on if you like and work with it. It's quite fascinating because I think life, there's a biblical thing, seek and you shall find. It's in a way, the universe is saying that to us. Whatever you want to seek, seek it with a question. And life will reveal to you experiences through which you can derive the answer to that. Not that there is an answer, but you will derive enough, more and more material around which to explore that question. So let's see, the next thing I think we'll talk about is identity and what I call a construct. Because at some point we've taken on this gestalt of being an entity or an object in the universe, in the world. And we've constructed an identity around that. Fundamental to the identity is how do I find safety in this existence? And I think that identity, in a sense, is our deeper uniqueness externalized because we've taken on the gestalt of being an object in the world. And what I want to say about that is, and we'll probably explore this a little more as we go along, I see everything as a composite. So rather than kind of accepting this unspoken concept that I am an entity, a separate entity in the world of entities, starting to explore this presentation that what I am is a composite. I'm a composite. My body's a composite of 5 elements. My mind is a composite of everything I've learned and experienced and think I know. My emotions are a composite of traumas and wounds and history and so many parts. So even this inner piece that we call spirit, I've come to understand is a composite. Okay, so now we're into understanding the identity. So understanding that we're in a frequency bandwidth and that we enter this frequency bandwidth. And that entry period we call conception and birth. It's when let's just say our spirit comes into the bandwidth, enters, and some people call that coming through the veil. Pretty much the same basic idea, but not exactly the same. Because they understand that this bandwidth has a skin or a threshold. So we're working with frequency. And there's this natural pressure here to figure out how to survive, to avoid uncertainty. And so as we start to take on the identity, much of what's happening is we're developing survival mechanisms in a world or a domain that's a bit foreign to spirit. Now, I happen to remember some of that, a significant portions of coming through conception and then trying to navigate, learning to navigate the human experience. What I remember is that when we come in, when we go through that veil or that skin, the spirit is used to a much higher frequency, and it's a more coherent, benevolent, well-organized frequency. And when we come in here, the frequency it appears or lands in us as being dissonant. So it's like, and I could go on with stories about how it's like a grading thing. I remember it enough that, so you're going from a higher frequency, it's like, and there's a perfection in it. And then it's like coming through a step down transformer. So the frequency gets stepped down and it goes from, and there's actually tones in my memory of what that was like, and this kind of grating shock of it to the spirit. So that sets up I would say a shock. I sometimes call this the trauma of incarnation, the trauma of conception. But that shock then gets established in the spirit and carried into the incarnation experience, along with the fact that the way in which we're welcomed or not welcomed here. Our welcoming committee is not very well educated. That's a big issue, a very big issue. So there's nobody here kind of orienting us properly, and we become oriented by the shock of the experience. Sometimes I actually refer to this as a event-oriented reality. We have the event of incarnating and the shock of that, and begin to ask, what the hell is going on here? What happened? Why am I feeling separate from God and all that? And once we begin to ask those questions, whether we're asking them conceptually or not, is quite dubious, at least not with language we're asking them. But then life begins to unfold out of that basic experience. And so we're looking then to find safety based on that shock. Now, here's an interesting thing that I'll mention, is that now what we start to do in night, as far as I can tell, what starts to happen is we're like asking this question of what's the shock about? What's this collision with the finite matter? What is going on? What's happening? Now, we're not yet have a conceptual mind. We're not yet in the matrix, but the question starts to draw to us archetypes from the collective mind, which resonate with the degree that we're conscious or unconscious and the gestalt feeling of the shock. So, here's how I've come to conclude that. Before my conception, I remember choosing to come here, consciously choosing, and I don't know about desiring, but definitely choosing to come here. And then when I'm at some point in the process, I took on this kind of thought matrix that I had done something wrong and God was punishing me. See, that didn't come from spirit. That came from the collective archetypes, the archetypes in the collective mind. And then based on the archetypes, starting to build a reality that confirms, confirmation bias confirms the conclusion that I came to. I hope you understand this, because to me, it's just like, it's fantastic, fantastic knowledge to work with.
Yeah, it's very clarifying.
Now here's the other piece. One of the first concepts that we pick up is birth. See, you, everyone, I assume everyone, maybe I'm completely wrong, but we're conscious before conception. We're conscious at conception, we're conscious in the womb, we're conscious during birth, we're conscious after birth. I as consciousness, I as spirit was not born. But if you watch a small child, when the adults come and meet the child, just notice what the adults do. Almost invariably, the adults will say, "How old are you?" They don't ask the name, because if they're getting close to the child, they already know the child's name. Oh, Uncle Ben had a child named Freddie. Let's go see Freddie. So you meet Freddie or the little girl, and you lean in, and you're happy and delighted to meet them, and you say, "Oh, how old are you?" And the little child says, 2, 3. The child doesn't know yet that it's born, so it doesn't know what those. All it knows is, I'm getting loving attention. I feel safe with this person. It's like a bitter pill with a sugar coating. So the bitter pill is you were born, sucker. The coating is love and affection and benevolence. So the child, and I visited a lot of homes in my business as a landscaper, and I'd see this over and over. The mother would come and answer the door, the little kids would be behind her, kind of peeking out to see if it's safe. And once they knew that I was a safe person to be around, they'd come out and play with me, and we'd have a good time. So this slowly, the developing consciousness gets hypnotized to believe I was born. And that is the fundamental cornerstone to the power of identification, not as far as I can tell. And so when we begin to have these experiences of consciousness outside the matrix or beyond the skin, then we start to recognize consciousness as our true nature. And then we're able to work with this in a different way. So, but that idea of birth then becomes fundamental to the whole conceptual matrix of identity. So in this section, we're going to talk about the purpose of life. Like I've figured it out. First of all, there may not be any purpose. So that's option one, no purpose whatsoever. Secondly, there may be a purpose. Now, it came to me kind of intuitively that there are many purposes woven together into this experience. And when we're working with concepts and language, it's almost impossible to really convey truth, but we can point at something here. But what I want to talk about, first of all, is prior to coming here, in my memory and in what I've come to understand, and maybe it's my own confirmation bias, but we live in a state of perfect oneness, a state of wholeness. Now, maybe not everybody, there's other options here that we may explore a bit of that later on. But when we come from that perfect spirit, let's say, into this reality, the purpose means, why would we do that? Why would we go from perfection into this crazy mess? So here's my take on it. When we're in that magnificence, that glorious, beautiful place in spirit, we do have consciousness, we do have awareness. And within that is a seed of a desire to say thank you to the Creator for the gift of being aware. And unless you have, some people may not be so grateful for that gift, but at Spirit, I believe everybody's extremely grateful that I'm aware. The I sense is very different there than it is here. But this is such a inexplainable gift, that to have awareness, to be aware. And that seed then of being able to say thank you to the Creator is kind of, I would say, what draws us into this matrix. Because here, there is a real opportunity to demonstrate the love and gratitude we have for the gift of awareness to the Creator, into his or her or our creation. Because it's possible here. And we do that through service. Now, there's another piece of this I'll talk about a little bit, which may, because I'm always looking for new kind of horizons in how full my understanding is. My understanding is, and this came to me, one of the ways in which this came to me is from a book called The Cosmology of Evil. It was channeled by a guy named Kim Michaels. I haven't read the book, actually. Yeah, me and my reading we haven't been getting along too well lately. But something that I gathered from Kim's book, it's not just him, but a number of esoteric sources that have showed up in my life. In the grander, much grander picture of things, from source energy came what Kim calls a number of spheres. So the first sphere, the original sphere, maybe it'd be better to say paradigm, but sphere is a usable word here. None of these words are totally accurate. The sort of beings or inhabitants of that sphere, then their task is to become conscious of their oneness, fully conscious of their oneness within the context of that. Then a second sphere, a third and fourth. And each sphere then became more and more dense. And we're at the cusp of the most dense sphere that's ever been created. Now, ever, I don't know. I don't know about ever. But in this particular experiment, I don't want to go too far into how I hold that. But we're in the stage of experimenting with density to see how far can we take this density thing and bring in or align it with all the beings within it aware of their oneness, aware of the great oneness. So I think that's what we're up to. And I think that that's part of the way in which we get to participate in this creation of what we call the creation. What we call the creation is a way in which we actually participate in it by producing as well as we can and enlivening that sense of oneness within our own consciousness, within our own mind, within our heart, our body, our emotions. At all these levels, can we really include that, and can we live it? How thoroughly and how deeply, how profoundly can we live that? So it's game on when we get into this. There's a saying in the Bible, "For God so loved the world, He gave His only begotten Son." So I think, from God's viewpoint, His only begotten Son means every living being, and in relation to human, it means every human. Every human is God's only begotten child. Because God, I don't think God lives in the world of duality and polarization. God is a great conscious intelligence that exists in perfect oneness. And to this, I want to add, in order for us to grok this, and then a lot of people will ask the question, well, what's my purpose? What am I here for? What's my gift? And I think in order to optimize, in order to bring to fruition our gift, when I say God his only begotten Son, is that with each of us, God did bestow a particular gift or gifts that we then bring into the world. The gift is not for, my gift is not for me. The gift is not for me, it's for the world. And so the more I'm oriented towards the service to the creation, to the people around me, to the life itself, the more that gift is free to come through. Whereas if I'm trying to figure out my gift so I can enjoy it and profit from it, it's not going to optimize the process, quite frankly. So I think it's important also, and I encourage people to develop a long-term intention and empower that long-term intention. An intention means you're not trying to control, you just have the intention and you're willing to be guided by the universe. Just like you plug in your GPS, you put the location in, you let the GPS to show you the way. The GPS then is about learning to follow your intuition. But I would go so far as to say, have an intention that's greater than you expect to fulfill in one lifetime. If you have an intention, you think you can manage it in one lifetime, you're just not thinking big enough, in my opinion. Think much bigger, go beyond all that, and have an intention that you're like, oh my God, I can't do this in one lifetime. Now you're on to something. So these are the ways that you kind of tease out your highest intention. Now we're going to talk about the transition. So to me, death is a mythology. It's a mythology. As I talked about before, we were conscious before conception, during conception, so on. We're conscious now. So there's no death. To me, the only possible death ever is when we take on the feeling sense, the gestalt of separation from God. That's the only death ever. And it is a suicide. It's an act of suicide, although it's an unconscious act of suicide. And I've gone through some highlights of how I see that happening. And I've been investigating. You know, you'd think I'd be thinking about something more pertinent, and I didn't realize the pertinence of what I was looking at today on YouTube and papers I was quickly reading. But this, what psychology calls object permanence. And they teach that children take on object permanence around the age of 2, more or less. And I began to think about this in terms of the way we take on identity and the way we take on the gestalt of separation. Because in my experience prior to this, we lived in a reality in which whatever we conceived of, and it was not so much an individual mind as we experience it now, conceiving of a reality, but there was much less regulation of imagination. That's a simple way to say it. So we lived in a world where we knew that reality that we generated was generated, let's say, through imagination. Imagination in that domain is different than it is here. I don't want to say it's the same. But then part of what we develop here, or we're kind of trained into, is this idea of object permanence. Now there's a saying in the Vedas, a beautiful, one of my favorite sayings that I've ever encountered, not that I read the whole thing, is Yad Bhavam Tat Bhavati. It's pretty much saying that as you are, you're gonna as you are, so is the world. That's one translation. So as we're kind of figuring out the world, we think we're in some way we think we're understanding the world, which is actually placing a burden on ourselves. That's what it means, judge not, that you be not judged. When we judge something, when we think of something, when we take on a concept, that becomes a definition for myself. We're not exactly understanding the world. Whether we're understanding the world or not may or may not happen, but we're definitely taking on an identity for ourselves as we take on what we think is an understanding of the world. So the birth then is merely coming into this frequency and then being hypnotized into the delusion of separation. Now we want to talk about exiting that frequency, that bandwidth, which is sometimes called death, but to me that's a mythology. Now, one of the reasons I see it as a mythology is because the human psyche itself has a period of maturation, which I referred to as experimenting with a degree of density. Can we become conscious of the oneness, fully conscious of the oneness in a high degree of density? And a lot of it has to do with the regulation of imagination. Because when we come in here, we're not familiar with having our imagination be so extremely regulated. You know, for example, let's say you want to buy a Mercedes-Benz. You want to have a Mercedes-Benz. If you were in pure spirit and you think Mercedes-Benz would be there. You know, you'd get together with some other spirits or whatever it's like there. And you think, oh, we don't need food, but let's go have a restaurant experience. So the restaurant's there and you go through that whole experience. But here, there's this kind of unnatural for us as spirit and great high degree of regulation of imagination. So we think of the Mercedes-Benz and then we have to go shopping for it. We have to pick out colors and engine types and all those things. And then we have to go through financing. It may take a few months for that Mercedes-Benz to be sitting in the driveway. And that's one of the reasons I believe young children are sometimes go into like tantrums and stuff. Because I think they remember how easy it was to manifest their imagination in this reality. And the other reality, they kind of remember that and they're like, why is it not happening here? So it's a tremendous frustration, and child just throws a tantrum and screams. And if you watch children when this is happening, you can feel it in your body. You'll be able to detect and feel what the child is going through. See, I remember when I was young, probably 5 years old, 6 years old, you know, I grew up in the mountains and we had a very, very primitive lifestyle. So we had chickens and dogs and cows and all those animals. And one day, I didn't know what was going on. We had this dog named Rex, and we loved this dog. I don't know how my parents felt about him, but the dog Rex killed a chicken one day. Now, for country people, dog killing a chicken is not a good thing. Because when the dog kills a chicken, he gets the taste of the blood and he'll kill all the chickens. So my dad took the dog and a rifle and me out into the woods, tied the dog to a tree. And when the dog was all splattered, I'm like, wait a minute, I'll just fix the dog. I had no doubt I could just bring that dog, you know, restabilize the dog. And I couldn't. And it was like this, it's like, holy shit, what's wrong? What's wrong with me? Why isn't this working? So it was another kind of dissociation for me as a child. And I think that we all go through a kind of dissociation. Often in Trillium, we talk about dissociation as escape into consciousness. But also, there's another way of looking at dissociation, is when we step into separation through these traumatic experiences of having our imagination regulated, which to us as spirit is an extreme experience. Even that is highly traumatic in itself. And so somewhere in there, we kind of externalize our power. We give our power to the reality outside us through this process of incarnating, finding a survival mechanism, and going through that shock of not being able to manifest according to the way we've learned or developed or understand from being in spirit. Yeah, that's a terrible story about the dog, but it's a good example so that you might even have some recollection of things that happened to you in that way. So now here's what happens when, let's see, do we want to talk about something? Some of the things that I'm going to talk about now don't necessarily apply to someone who is awakened. Personally, I don't think there's such a thing as awakened, but there's some kind of threshold we go through. We've got to give it a label. It's just, there's something in us that needs to sort of announce it or proclaim there's been this shift. I think there's just this ongoing process of awakening. At least for me, it's working that way. And I love Rod's whole model, but I can't really track it as well. But yeah, a lot of people go into this kind of thing of nuancing the awakening process, and I love it, but it's not where my passion is right now. But so most people then, as far as I can tell, when there's this separation from the body, then imagination becomes dysregulated. Now we've gone from developing a strategy and methodology and understanding of how to work with this high degree of regulation of imagination. Now, if you take just a side point here, if you take a look at this and you start to look at poverty and wealth, illness and health in the people around us, you can see there's an important component here. So many, let's say, probably many new souls are going to go through some version of poverty and hunger and all that, of struggling with survival, because they're still adjusting to being human. They're still learning to be human. They're still kind of navigating this thing of having the shock of having the imagination so highly regulated. But when we step out of the body, then the imagination becomes dysregulated. And then I think what happens then, now let me just say, I've listened to many hundreds of hours and read accounts of near-death experiences, psychics, mediums. Now there's a tendency to categorize the whole thing as STE, spiritually transformative experience. And so I kind of put together my memory and my experience and my understanding, and I've used these things that I've been exposed to put together a picture that hopefully will be helpful to us. Now, then with the imagination suddenly dysregulated, the discarnate person or discarnate being, whatever is kind of turning in their psyche is still going to be there. And so if they've had a kind of criminal-like or whatever life, drug addiction, criminality, these kind of things, they're likely to imagine some pretty horrible things, which, let's say they get out of their body and they really, oh, I think I'm dead. Oh my God, what about all those sins? I haven't accounted for all those sins. What if the devil comes for me? Boom, the devil's there. And the devil says, oh, okay, come with me. That is a product of a dysregulated imagination, but it's based on kind of conditioning that we had in our human life experience. Now, a big problem is that when people do exit their body and the imagination becomes dysregulated, is this whole ideal of guilt and punishment, kind of the alpha male polarized model of life that we've lived under, along with the deeply embedded beliefs of Newtonian mechanics. should that experience then will kind of need to be lived out for some time. It'll kind of need to be gone through. So there's the dark side of the dysregulation of imagination. Now, there's also the light side. And, you know, when I talk about this, it may be found to be offensive to some people who would listen to this. I don't know who's going to listen to this. I don't mean to offend anyone. But the light side of this is that, oh, I've been a good Christian. I've lived a good life. Jesus is going to come get me. We're going to go to heaven. Yay, yay, yay. And so, yeah, that all works out according to the imagination, according to the deeply embedded belief structures. So our dominant fears and loves then begin to manifest. Now, most of the experiences of near-death experience, most of those things are happening in what we can call the alpha, the astral domain. At some point, we're going to go beyond the astral domain into the next whatever. And I've listened to so many of these, and I've come to the conclusion that, let's say when a person's lived a good life, they haven't developed a recognition of consciousness, they don't recognize the formlessness of their true nature, they will tend to recreate a heavenly version of their life here. I think built into the structure of creation is a kind of compensation for how difficult it was here. Let's say God or spirit recognizes that it's a pretty difficult workout here. And so, okay, now you tried to get a good marriage, you tried to get a good home and flowers and gardens and all the beautiful things you really wanted to have. Okay, now you're going to go into this other domain, this kind of heavenly domain, and all that's going to be there. Fantastic. So you get to complete your bucket list, your desire list. And you know, you don't have to deal with suffering and disease and conflict and war and all that. You get this kind of precious and desirable completion of what you were struggling with here. That's just the way I think it works. Is it real or is it not real? I mean, you can apply that question to anything. You really can, as far as I can tell. Is there anything that's real other than I don't know anything? The I don't knowing, that place of I don't know, I'm conscious, but I don't know anything is probably the most real thing. At least the context for the most real thing. But I want to talk a little bit about this, and at some point we're going to move into how this applies to Trillium Awakening, but I'm not going to do a thorough investigation of that. So there's a book I just saw. I found it really fascinating. The author's name is Father Nathan Castle, called Afterlife Interrupted. And so how can I encapsulate this? Father Nathan Castle was, I believe, a Dominican priest. He was in that Dominican order. And he began to have contact from people who had passed away, who didn't or couldn't complete their transition. And he talks about tells about 20 of these. And it's also in alignment with my experience and understanding. So when the person gets out the body, the natural order, I think, will be, for most people, would be that someone from the other side, a loved one, an ancestor, or a spiritual figure would appear and say, "Oh, come on up with me." Now, if the person goes into a tight contraction, because oftentimes it's because they fear punishment by God because of whatever they've done. So they can remain in that contraction for a fairly long period of time in what we perceive as time. It could go on for many years. And I've done a bit of this work myself where I help these people complete their transition. when I say I, sometimes I'm referring to the Allan character, and sometimes I'm referring to a higher aspect of myself, where the Allan character is not there, but the consciousness here can bleed into that. So, I think it's important as we're moving forward into the new human era that a lot of these, let's call them ghosts, can be kind of cleaned up around the planet, because they can't function here because they don't have the body, they're not able to function according to the laws of so-called laws of nature, because they're not really in that matrix. But there's a way they can manipulate that. I'm not going to go into it here. There is a way that they can manipulate so-called matter to make things appear to happen. But generally, they have to be a little more mature than, let's say, most people. I don't know if most is even true or not. So that's why it's important for there to be an engagement of the person as they're at some stage in their life of forgiveness of self, forgiveness of others, a work around forgiveness. Now, I'll mention how we do that a little bit later. I want to say, so we talked a little bit about what is a human. Now we're talking about what's sometimes called a ghost or an earthbound. So the earthbounds are generally the gestalt that's left over when a person passes, who still thinks of themselves as an entity, and they have fear or hesitation or regret, and they don't move on. And they can cling to a place, or they can cling to another person. And they often will embed themselves into the energy field of another person. And they don't exactly influence the other person. They don't necessarily try to manipulate the other person. For the most part, they're just kind of dazed. But they do, I would say, retard, or they can retard that person's spiritual development. They can put a damper on it because their emotions and structures tend to influence the person. And this is, my guess is pretty prevalent. I've read or heard that up to 25% of people who transition don't go through the natural process, don't complete the transition. And like I said, I've done a little bit of work helping some of these people, and I've come to understand a bit of it. I'm not as adept as Father Nathan Castle, but I've done some work with it. Let's see, so now we want to start moving towards, let me do a little bit of this and we'll transition into our work. I'm not going to say much about maybe I'll say a little bit about transitioning for awakened people and something about that. But I want to explore something. I have this kind of saying that anything is caused by everything. Anything is caused by everything. And this is a shorthand for releasing the binding influence of karma. I think it's important for us to develop within ourselves some kind of grasp of this. And I think we do to certain degrees now. People will argue with me about this, but I'll stay with it. I think it was Stephen Hawking who said it this way: if you want to make an apple pie from scratch, you have to reinvent the universe. You got to come up with a planet, it's got to have soil, it's got to have water, yada, yada, yada. Then you got to make apples, and then you can make your apple pie from scratch. So anything is caused by everything. And there's an Islamic prayer, Allah Malik. Basically, that's saying the same thing. Allah Malik. Everything is done by God. Everything is God's will. So to me, it's really pointing at the same fundamental understanding. I do a practice. I don't think we're going to go into it here, but I do a practice with people that I've worked with for a while, which I call releasing the negative karmic influence. Let me give a little background. I'll just give some background to that practice so that I can communicate what I'm trying to communicate here about negative karmic influence. So let's say you have a young nurse who's starting into practice, and she's happy to be in the hospital, and she's put in the ER, and she's pretty new. And an elderly man comes into ER. He's got a dislocated shoulder. Now, the protocol, I believe, is she used to give him a muscle relaxant and have him lay down and just rest. They want the man to just completely rest, and the body will bring it back into alignment. And then if it doesn't, then the next step, I think, is to bring in an OT or someone like that who can help with the man. Okay, so what happens is with this young nurse, she follows the procedure, and the elderly man has an aspiration, develops pneumonia, which is one of the highest mortality rates in elderly people is pneumonia. So then the young nurse is kind of horrified, and she concludes, I really screwed up this man. I've done something really bad. Now, out of her conclusion unfolds a negative karmic influence. It's not the action. She followed the protocol. So she took on a high degree of agency in that action, even though she meant no harm. She wanted to help this man. She loved her work, but she took on the agency of, I've done something wrong. And certainly religion will do everything it can to support her in that. Being a little facetious, but you get the point. So now, as we become more conscious, we have consciously evolved beyond many of our negative karmic influence. And in my opinion, that doesn't do the whole story. That doesn't really clean it up. It can still come back and affect us and come into our experience because we planted the seeds for it. So the process I have is to take someone consciously through a process of releasing that. I'm not saying it's the best one or even a good one. It's just what I've learned to do. And I think that our work as trilling working teachers is to work with that energy. Not necessarily the way I do it. Everybody, I think, will have their own way. So, and I want to say one more thing about this term samsara. There's a term in India, samsara, which it basically means everything is cyclical. And so when people get into a negative karmic influence, they tend to fall into a cycle of repeating the same old thing. And you'll see that in what do we call it? Trauma loops, where you get into a trauma and your mind goes through a looping thing and your life goes through this whole loop of trauma. So that's the nature of the world here until we develop this consciousness and can begin to work with it in a different way, can begin to steer it in a different way. And that's where our work really, I think our work is really important, is being able to stay with people and help them kind of get out of that loop, that samsara spin. So one of the things that I think we do in our practice of holding and greenlighting people is it has a lot of similarity to what people who pass away call a life review. In the life review, the person typically, after a certain passage in their process of transitioning, they might meet with a god or elder or a group of elders, and their life goes, they have a life review. Now, this often happens pretty early on in the process, as far as I understand. And it's the life review, then you see your whole life very, very completely, and you begin to experience what other people around you were experiencing as in conjunction with your actions and words. So when you hurt someone, you might not even have noticed it, but in the past life review, you will know that, you will see it, and you will feel what they felt. So it's a kind of hologram experience of your life, a life review. And this is one of the issues that people face in transition, is that Spirit is encouraging them to simply digest the information, the material, and then continue on in a healthy, progressive way. But oftentimes the person who's still convinced of entityhood will want to punish themselves and will want to inflict more karmic samsara, more karmic repetition on themselves. So our green lighting and holding is a way of helping people to do that here and now, rather than waiting until the hereafter, so to speak, and then go through a whole nother loop of incarnating to work out this issue. I have a diagram on my website called The Journey of the Soul. It starts off as a cycle. What do you call a cycle when it expands? God, I can't think of the word for that. So that you have a circle that expands and expands and expands.
Is it a fractal?
That's not the word I'm looking for. It'll come to me.
Anyway.
But anyhow, the early stages of that are black and white, and the circles are fairly small. And then they get broader as the soul goes on through that journey. It gets broader and more colorful. So what we're doing this is, in a way, we're helping to bring some of the functionality of the other dimensions into this dimension, which is part and parcel of having of the recognition, the realization of our perfect oneness in a world of density. So this work fits into this whole paradigm that I'm presenting, this whole cosmology I'm talking about. And then beginning to disrupt some of this cyclical reincarnation pattern that it's purposeful and useful up to a certain stage, but at some point, we're ready to outgrow it, but we don't have the tools and the information to even know we can. Religion is basically postpone the whole thing. Oh, whatever you're suffering here is natural. You'll die and you'll go to whatever you'll go to, whatever they're saying. But what we're doing is helping integrate the spiritual functioning with this density, and to help anchor that oneness as efficiently as possible. And So that's an important part of the work we do, is having people, because when people can express their most troubling issues and the things that trouble them the most, which anywhere else they express it, they're going to be, in some way, the people around them are going to move away from them because they haven't, the people around them aren't suffering with the same dilemma. So it just reinforces the dilemma. Whereas when we're able to be present, ask consciousness for people to give expression to this, that energy can move, because everything within the skin has a time of appearing, it has a trajectory, and it has a natural end. We call it birth and death in terms of the body. But even the sun has an origin and has a time when it will complete, has a journey in between. So all of these karmic energies have a natural coming into existence, they have a natural trajectory, and they have a natural ending. So in a way, when we're holding people and being with people and exploring what troubles them, we're giving permission for that particular energy pattern to complete its journey. Just by giving it attention, just by being conscious of it, because everything here is made of energy and consciousness. Everything without exception is energy and consciousness in congealed form. So when we're just giving it consciousness through our attention, we're giving it what it's made of. And when it receives that, it will move according to its own needs. We don't necessarily know what the person needs or how it should move, but just by giving this compassionate, holding attention, we're giving consciousness to that which does want to move. It wants to be included. And it can complete itself. What do we want to talk about now so we can start to conclude? Okay, so the knowledge, then what happens when we do this together, we start to transcend or go beyond the need for polarity. So long as you're completely trapped in the matrix of identification, the polarity is very important. So now you have the Republicans versus the Democrats. You have the left versus the right. And that's a lot of tension around the polarity. And that polarization is part of how we feel safe. Having come from spirit into this density, we build out a mechanism and pattern of feeling safe by clinging to the good and avoiding the bad, or clinging to the bad and avoiding the good, whatever. We're trying to strengthen one part and deny the other part. So long as we're doing that in any version, it keeps us locked into identification with the manifestation and all its processes. At some point, we need to go beyond that, or to simply see polarization as an element of this. And when we do that consciously, a whole nother world of knowledge becomes available that's not contingent on polarization. Then our gifts are much more available and much more productive. So let me just conclude with one thing, and then we'll call it an end. So I mentioned before that, as I see it, a person is not an entity. A person is a composite. Now, I don't know exactly how this works, but I presume that what we call our spirit is also a composite. Now, I've had several experiences of my past lives, but I'm kind of, okay, could be, maybe, maybe not. Where I kind of stand with it now is there are many lives in this, let's say, the history of this particular human experience. There are many lives. And so each of those lives has a spirit. But if the spirit is a composite, that means in my life right now, I can be drawing upon composites of many other spirits Now, is there a particular strain that's my strain and it's hard and fixed and all that? Well, maybe, but I don't think so. Let's say we have a spirit guide, and some people like to have a name and a picture of their spirit guide, and they talk to their spirit guide. So my view is, and I've had this confirmed by, I do a little study of the work of Cryon, the Master Cryon. And I recently got confirmation on this thing that I was building out in my cosmology, that even if you say you have a spirit guide, fine and dandy, if you need a name and a form and all that, have it, no problem. But that spirit guide is simply a point of reference to all of spirit. So spirit is a vast complexity. It's infinite, I would say. At least, maybe it's finite, but from our perspective, it certainly is infinite. And so that the totality of spirit then is there to guide us and assist us. And it can take on a form and a name if we need it, but I don't think that's how it works in the deeper reality. So what I want to do is look beyond what we think of as real and stable. So that, and I'm just giving this spirit guide as an example to reference what you are, what I am, and to begin to see and experience each other as this magnificence, a composite of spirit. And if you want to think of it as a composite of past lives, fine. To me, that's just a model. It's not necessarily the finer truth, but it's a helpful model to point at what I'm talking about. And there's a profound and relentless uniqueness to each incarnating spirit. And when we have, the more we are awake and stable in that awakening, the more that spirit gets produced, it gets manifested into the matrix. So in India, they worship many saints and God men. They worship them as God, but this is what they're pointing at. It's not the way the Western mind interprets it as idol worship. It's simply recognizing that some presences, that greater consciousness has congealed in them as to make them permanently available. So there's something that becomes permanent in the matrix when people awaken to the degree they are awakened and stable in that awakening. So it's the greater consciousness then congealing into something that stays in the human matrix. It remains in the human matrix. Now I have dreams and experiences of Ramana Maharshi. Does that mean Ramana is still there? Well, yes and no. He's there. He's permanently there. He's always there. Cannot leave. He cannot go anywhere. But it's not an entity, Ramana Maharshi, who's there, who's advising me and helping me and all that. It's just tapping into that consciousness. And there, when I experience it, I'm just like madly in love with him. And I give myself permission to experience him as an entity. It doesn't mean that that's my highest thought. It just means that's the way I feel the devotion and the love and the joy of the encounter. So I just want to point that out and see, encourage, I guess, people to explore the question of that and develop maybe their own cosmology. Didn't have to agree with mine. What I like to do with exploring a way of holding something or conceptualizing something is what way of holding or conceptualizing something empowers, optimizes the. One thing I didn't bring up is kind of what I think is like kind of, it's difficult to talk about this because I've got to use language and concepts that are going to exclude things I don't at all mean to exclude, but there's, so I'm going to say some things very crudely, but the options then in the so-called afterlife of an awakened person are much vaster. hopefully we won't necessarily have to go to a heaven and build out some version of the life we tried to have here. It's not a bad thing. It's really, there's a lot of joy in it. There's a lot of satisfaction in it. But there's also so many other options that are available. And I don't really know how to explain them. I have some sense of them. But the old saying, birds of a feather flock together, I think applies. So, I had an uncle, and I didn't have a lot of closeness with him over the years, but I loved him. He was quite a bit younger than my dad. And when I kind of tried to contact him on the other side, he was all into sports, and now he's playing sports. He really loved sports in his human life. So now he's really into it. And he's just like, he's so busy with it. He's like, oh, hello, but I don't really want to spend time with you. I want to go back to doing my thing with the sports. And then one of my forays, at one time I was just curious what all my past relatives are doing. So I did this little process to go check on them. And when I went in, I kind of popped into this dimension where I encountered Ramana and the one called Jesus and Yogananda.
Mm.
Wow. The bliss there is beyond that whole heavenly joy thing, the heavenly joy that the humans who haven't. It sounds not hierarchical, but I don't see it that way. I wish I could express this without it sounding like hierarchical and superior and all that. It's not what I intend to convey. That's part of the density of matter, is we have this kind of need this thing to survive here, and we tend to project it into the spirit where it doesn't really belong. Mm-hmm. But I do want to say something about these greater options, because one of the common features that I've found in NDEs and STEs, psychics and mediums and all that, is that when people pass, they have higher options, which they don't necessarily take. Because spirit will be encouraging them to choose those higher options, but oftentimes they don't take them. And so in the let's say the spirit world, people will tend to end up with like similar beings. Birds of a feather flock together seems to apply. And if they do go into a higher frequency domain, they really won't be able to stabilize there most of the time. They'll kind of go back to that structure and domain in which they're more at ease. And the other thing is, I'm based again on my experience and understanding so far. When our consciousness evolves beyond the need for polarization, beyond the need for density, we do seem to have the capacity to function in many different formats. I would say we could have as many as, I don't know a number, but I've heard the number 50. That's coming in my mind for some reason. We could have up to 50 different venues going on simultaneously. So we could be participating in the spirit guide functioning. We could be participating in helping spirits who are transitioning, helping them with the transition. We could be working on kind of that astrophysics. Is that the right word? I had an experience once where I found myself in spirit. And normally when we're doing things in spirit, it's not an individual doing things, but there's a kind of consortium or composite of different spiritual energies, or what we would call different people, who were working conjunction. And what we were doing at this experience of mine, what we were doing is we were experimenting with the dimensions of a solar system, like the distance from moon to sun and the different planets and all that. We were working with those dimensions to optimize the development of life in that planet or solar system. I've had experiences of being in other dimensions, working in what I call the death room, or the second death. So the people go into heaven and hell and all that. At some point they seem to go through what I call a second death. So they go beyond that into, they may come back into incarnation, or they may go to a next higher realm. The ones that I worked with went into a higher realm. Now I don't recommend doing this. Just kind of hold it as a possibility, because what happened to me whenever it's like the consciousness that's here, congealed as Allan, sort of gets pulled into that other dimension for reasons. I don't know if it was for the education of the character Allan, or it was because that energy was needed for this other functionality. I kind of think the latter, but I'm not sure. But it tended to take a toll on my body. So when I'd come back in, I'd be disoriented, and I'd be kind of ill for a few days. So I don't recommend it as a practice. I don't recommend you attempt this, but just to become sensitive to this information, that most likely your spirit, your soul, has a lot more going on than just this little human encapsulation. So that the reason I talk about this is to help kind of declutch this whole hierarchical thing. You could be, this example was given to me by Stuart Wilde back in the 80s. You could go to the gas pump and some guy's pumping their gas and he looks like a total moron. He's drooling on himself. You're like he's illiterate and he seems stupid. This could just be a manifestation into human form of a Mahatma, a great soul, who's doing many things in the cosmic dimensions. And he just needed a little bit of human experience to polish up some part of his great soul. Mm-hmm. So part of one of the things maybe this would be the last thing I talk about is, I think part of what I also want to convey is it's very important, the work we're doing. I think that spirit or God or the higher intelligence, there are many things they would like to implement here, but spirit can't implement things here. It needs feet on the ground, it needs hands, it needs eyes, it needs human bodies to produce manifestation through, at least parts of manifestation. Spirit can do its part, but there's a way in which our showing up as best we can, and as clumsy as we often are, spirit can manifest things through us that can only happen in that way. And I'm not going to go into the stories of how I came to know this, but based on my own experience, quite a bit of experience, actually, a number of experiences that led me to this conclusion. So I think that's it, Deborah.
Well, just beautiful. Thank you so much, Allan. If people have questions or want to get in touch with you to explore any of this further, could you just say the name of your website?
It's nothingother.com. Nothin, nothing other, OTHER.
Excellent.
And my email is Allan, ALLAN, @nothingother.com.
Great.
I don't know if there's much more I could convey, but I really enjoyed this. It's very exciting and fulfilling for me to be able to convey this.
Yeah, thank you so much.